We touched on this a little bit earlier. When you bring in a guy like Brandon Ingram and you add him to a core that already features Scotty Barnes, it introduces some possible complications when it comes to how they'll fit together on the court. When you look at where these guys like to get their baskets at, and you directly mentioned Scotty Barnes is just his love for the mid-range recently and how he's kind of gravitated to that area. So Scotty takes a whole lot of his attempts from there. He takes about 48% of his shots from the mid-range. That puts him in the 98th percentile for his position. So one of the most mid-range heavy guys from his position. And then Brandon Ingram is just above him at 50% of all his shots.
99th percentile, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. So Clean Glass has those numbers for us, and it kind of paints a picture of like, hey, these guys love that mid-range area. So obviously, if they both love to operate in there, and then Barrett as well. I mean, he's a lot lower, but he's still above average. 28% of his shots are in that mid-range. So you throw in Ingram to this mix of what they have going on here in the mid-range. Ingram and Barnes, they also don't like to take a lot of threes. It looks like there's going to be some growing pains here. There's going to be a learning curve. So I think that's one area of this trade that made me kind of have some questions about it, have some concerns.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it. And then there's also just the health aspect when it comes to Brandon Ingram. You won't have to worry about fit concerns if he's not playing. He has missed quite a lot of games. So this season is the third time he's missed at least 30 games over the course of a season. So when you think about that, it's like, man, like he hasn't even been available that much. He's currently injured with an ankle injury. Yeah. So,
and I would be surprised if he comes back this season, to be honest.
I would too. I was just thinking that, like they said indefinitely, but I don't see him coming back. Like, what's the point really at this point? They're so far gone. So on-court perspective, there are questions, there are concerns. Do you think they're overblown? Do you think there's some legitimacy to all this? You know, what are your thoughts about how these guys are going to interact once they're all on the court together?
Man, I've done like a complete 180 on this since they acquired BI. At first, I was not a fan of the on-court fit because, like you, concerned about some of the duplication on the team, some of the mid-range scoring issues, and kind of guys working in similar areas. How does it work with Barrett, who's not necessarily a three-point shooter? Are they going to end up moving Barrett? And what's the equation to everything they want to do on court? Also, you know, they're already bottom of the league in 3-point rate. I believe they're 29th in 3-point rate this season. So they're not a team that likes to take threes anyways. Adding a guy like Ingram, who has improved, in my opinion, as a 3-point shooter, still not a guy who likes to take a ton. I think that's part of like the calculus of, okay, what is this fit here? You know, what does this even look like on the court? That said, after watching Ingram tape, I think there's a lot more than meets the eye. First of all, the health is a major part of this. No question to that. Like, he has to stay healthy. And I think that's a major part of like how this team looks moving forward. But the Raptors really desperately need a guy who can make life easier for Scotty Barnes. And I think in that realm, BI accomplishes that as a guy who can just score buckets. There's so many possessions where the Raptors half-court offense gets mulled down. They don't have any sort of offense. They don't have any sort of like shot-making ability. And so they end up with a pretty tough shot. Brandon Ingram is a tough shot maker. And if there's one thing that he's really good at doing, it's taking those shots and making those shots. So ultimately, I think for a team that is struggling in the shot-making department and the shot creation department, BI fills a role. And I think ultimately how much more he can tap into the off-ball stuff. You know, he's a 40% catch and shoot player, doesn't take a whole ton of catch and shoot threes, but ultimately he's a guy who over the last couple of seasons has taken over 6 threes a game and has hit them on like decent volume, 37, 36%. I do think some of the 3-point shooting kind of questions are overblown a little bit when it comes to BI. He does take threes, and that says a lot for a team like the Raptors, who really doesn't take a lot of threes at all. So it's sort of like finding water in the desert, so to speak, when it comes to Brandon Ingram. He's the type of player they need right now for this iteration. What does that look for their ceiling and the type of team they will be offensively and defensively moving forward? I think it's a question of buy-in from both sides. Like, are you going to adapt to the way Brandon Ingram likes to play, which is holding the ball, which is, you know, working as a pick and roll player and as a guy who can operate in the pick and roll often? The Raptors don't run a ton of pick and roll. They like to move the ball a lot. And so how do you adapt to that? But also, how does Brandon Ingram adapt to your style offensively? So, yeah, I have a lot of questions moving forward, but I have warmed up to the idea that Ingram is going to be a pretty good fit for this Raptors team just because they severely lack in the shot making department right now. And I think
Mhm.
that will overall make Scotty's life a little bit easier.
For sure. No, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that part of everything when it comes to their offense. They are a shot making star team, like you said. So
Yeah.
bringing in a guy like that, if that's what you need, he's one of the best. Like
Yeah.
that's his calling card. That's his bread and butter, is to create something out of nothing, make tough shots. And yes, his last playoff appearance there in New Orleans against the Thunder was disappointing to say the least.
Yeah.
But we have seen that you get to that stage of the season, the postseason, you need guys like that to be able to get some shots off when the defense clamps down, the game slows down. I think he'll be in his element there for sure.
For sure.
And I think when it comes to Scotty Barnes, I mean, he's young enough that I think he can make somewhat of a transition. I wouldn't expect anything drastic from him in terms of a change, but he could start to cut down a little bit of those mid-range attempts and make some room there for Brandon. Operate in a slightly different way. Maybe get a little bit up that 3-point percentage or 3-point rate a little bit to kind of compensate. When you got a guy like Brandon, he's in the prime of his career. He's in his late 20s. It's I think it's harder for a guy like that to just completely change the way he plays.
Yeah.
But for Scotty, I mean, he's been doing it like we were talking about for the first 4 years of his career.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of trying to tinker with things and find where he works best. So from that perspective, yeah, I would say it can definitely work out. They're going to need some time to work on it, and I think a full off season, letting guys get right and things kind of play out, getting in the gym together is going to help a lot and produce a pretty good product when they get back on the court next season. So I think from that perspective, it can work out.
Yeah, I think like when you look at all the things that have plagued this team over the last season or two, it was shot making in the half court. It was a guy who could just get to a bucket eventually. And Brandon Ingram checks those categories. Like that's exactly the type of player that he is. Now, how does that all kind of work and acquiesce with a guy like Scotty Barnes? That's a question moving forward. But ultimately, I think they're in a better position now than they were before the trade deadline, just in terms of talent. Like you add talent to this team, that's a genuine upgrade. And you just have more flexibility to work with that talent moving forward. And we'll see. We'll see if they kind of work well together. If not, they can kind of figure out something else and see what the next version of this team is.